especially, I might say, young women, when there wasn't always a lot of encouragement for them to seek a career in the subject. We published my first journal article, and 10 years later, commissioned, cajoled, awaited patiently, and eventually published a review article. Both were on Theophylact of Ochrid, Byzantine Archbishop of Bulgaria from around 1089 to 90, possibly after 1122. Petra asked me to talk today about Theophylact. I could have spoken about women, but his women were all patrons, whether terrestrial or heavenly, and I prefer to think about his relations with the young, his pupils and ex-pupils. He also tells us that he privileged relations with the young. There's been a great deal of excellent work recently on Paideia and cultural capital. Joyce Bernard has shown how important learning and literati were in the new meritocratic conditions of the 11th century. The volume on networks of learning includes case studies on the 12th century by Michael Grunbart and Foti Nicolaou, and more recently Alex Avila has looked at 3 stages of the importance of epistolographic networks in the late period, when literati acted as brokers between the court and less influential subjects. We're all awaiting the concluding volumes from Niels Gaal's ERC project on Paideia in Middle Byzantium and Tang in China. Mine today is a very small contribution to fill a gap, one which I did not pursue in my book. The teacher-pupil relations of Theophylact are not as clear as in the Paleologan period studied by Gaal and Wheeler, and we cannot yet see the strong genealogical lines of teaching visible there. We don't, for example, know for certain that Theophylact was the pupil of Psellos. There's no doubt that teaching was important in any scholar's career, whether lifelong, as with Theodore Prothromos and John Tzetzes, or as a career stage to preferment, as with Theophylact and many other 12th century bishops. At first sight, what we can see of his relations with pupils would not have impressed Virginia. 3 texts, 2 logii and a letter, reveal his difficulties over teaching both in Constantinople before and in Bulgaria after his appointment to the see. The first, G1, accuses his students of disorderliness and defends himself against a jealous rival, a father who beats his children but then kisses them tenderly. The second, G2, addressed for pairs, explains his philosophy of teaching and his unwillingness against the desires of some students to teach homogeneous. The third, G103, to the Bulgarians he taught, is both an apology for not being able through illness to be present with his most desired ones, and a warning not to proceed in some current enterprise. These texts are very general, not to say mysterious. They don't identify individuals. We need to go to the letter collection to identify ex-pupils, and since that's what letters are good for, their exact relations with Theophylact. A possible start might be with fictive kinship. Just as brother can mean a colleague or friend, father, superordinate, son has many meanings besides the obvious biological sense, and teacher-pupil relations are among them. 9 correspondents of Theophylact are addressed as son, with various adjectival qualifiers. Sometimes they're pair, sometimes tech. They're found in my network, in his personal cell, his intimate zone, and his affective zone. 3 have supporting external evidence for their status as ex-pupil. Michael Pantechnes, in the lemma of G102, is described as his pupil Pantechnes, Kier Michael the Doctor. Gregory Kamateros is identified by George Tourniquet in letter 10 as a pupil of Theophylact. The lemma of G84 calls Nikitas Ortukakidons the pupil. And though we don't have any letters to him, Theophylact's speech against the Latins is dedicated to Nicholas Deacon and Camstresios Sophia Sophia and future Bishop of Maleshova. The lemma only says he was a pupil. Demetrius Komatinos fills in the rest, while Theophylact addresses him as Ersevestemi Engelionier. Again, though we have no letters to him, we may be sure from G28 to Theodore of Smyrna that Theodore's brother Paul was taught by Theophylact, just as Theophylact's brother Demetrius was taught by Theodore. 6 other correspondents are designated as son without supporting external evidence for a teacher-pupil relationship. For Gautier, in his edition of the letters, adds 3 others, all in my network part of Theophylact's personal cell. There are, of course, other possibilities. They could simply be younger than Theophylact, but forms of address in Theophylact a bit more studied than that. They could possibly be subordinates, yet all the suffragan bishops in the correspondence are addressed as adher, brother. They could be sons in ritual kinship, but holy orders precluded standing godfather to a child. And adoption similarly seems unlikely for the same reason. In spiritual kinships, also unlikely. Theophylact was not a monk, and his attitude to monks was, of course, the ribaldry in his household. And finally, they could be in a patronage relationship as clients or protégés, yet, as we shall see, most are more likely to be patrons of Theophylact than clients. If we look outside fictive kin, there are strong relationships in the 11th and 12th centuries between episcopal uncles and academic nephews, yet would not the son be known as Octu Vulgarius? We know no one with that designation, and one confirmed pupil son, Nikitas, is already associated with the Bishop of Chalcedon. So let's proceed with a hypothesis that they're pupils. What we can try to do is to take the confirmed pupils as templates and see whether any of the dubious 6 are at all similar. The first 2, Michael Pantechnius and Gregory Clementeros, are unhelpful in that they're multiplex, a very high level of intimacy, and recipients of 9 and 5 letters respectively, with 2 others that could be to either. But the third, Nikitas Otokarthodonos, the recipient of G84, is immediately helpful. Theophylact is writing to him to ask him to take action in the case of the Protostrata of Michael's canon breaking, and to deliver letters from Theophylact to the Protostrata himself, to Maria of Bulgaria, and to show one of them to Irene Vilkena. He couches the request in a parallel from Homer, the story of Antilochus, viewed in antiquity as a paragon of filial piety, who in Odyssey 4:188 risks danger for his father Nestor and is killed by the Ethiopian king Memnon. Theophylact asks a less dangerous favour from Nikitas that says that if he refuses, he will be denying the birth, the nurturing, the breastfeeding and weaning of his logos. And this, says Theophylact, is not going to happen. Give me this service, he says, and I will remit what you owe me. These themes reappear in other letters. The Antilochus story is recalled in G99 to Gregory Clementeros, where he's urged to use the weapons he gained from Logos and to hurl them at the Ethiopian. In doing so, he will protect his Nestor, i.e. Theophylact. The idea of weapons is picked up in G108 to the Archon of Prespa, appropriately since his name is the Macron Volitis, where it is Theophylact who will fire word arrows at the Archon, which others have said are cruel, something he's hitherto avoided. May he be urged on instead by flowers shot from his eloquence. He wants him to help organise a synod on Prespa. The idea of a debt structures the whole of G104, the only letter to John Nataliates, the protonotarius of the Lux of Natalia. Theophylact deserves thanks for leading John, while still young, to the divine charms of the Muses, saving and forming him. John cannot deny this debt unless he shows himself an entire stranger to the Muses. Theophylact then introduces the Bishop of Sidon, whom he says is one with himself. Now may Theophylact, or in fact Bishop, benefit from John's pains on his behalf, receiving John's care in exchange for Theophylact's. Once he hears that the bishop has been helped, he'll respond with paternal prayers capable of the support of the houses of his children. The letter is built entirely on reciprocity and on the conceit of a debt. Just as in G88 to Nikitas, Theophylact calls in the debt of teaching. In one more case, G42 to Theophylact Romeos, the idea of a debt reappears after he complains of his correspondent's silence and compares him to Aristotle disclaiming his old teacher Plato. But he says, his loss has been the gain of one John, very close to Theophylact's heart, and the gain of the parochie in the local church. I initiated you into rhetoric, says Theophylact. I remit your debt in exchange for what you have done for John. So 3 more sons may be seen as ex-pupils. Theophylact Romeos and John Ataliates quite clearly, Macrovolitis quite possibly so. We're left to decide the relationship with 3 more sons and Gautier's proposed possibles from Theophylact's personal cell. Of these, Pakoyanos, Anamas, and Ophiomakos are local officials. Paranites, the military hero, Mementulos, the grand gregarios of the watch, and the Didaskalos, a patriarchal academic. We should perhaps compare them with letters to the now larger group of confirmed ex-pupils' sons first. We should look at forms of address. Confirmed ex-pupils are addressed formally and less formally. Gregory Kamateros as Kelbesputa, to his year, a mark of respect. We can also adduce for churchmen, Eplabesphemian Yeriolia, which is how Theophylact addresses Nicholas, deacon, and Canstresios of Hagia Sophia, identified as a pupil by the level. If we turn to the dubious sons, the most puzzling case is the Didaskalos of the Great Church in G91. Two other letters, G7, G70, are to the Didaskalos of the Great Church, Kien Kitas Otiseron, and to the Didaskalos, Kien Kitas Otiseron. G7 is a first arrival in C letter, G70, a modest response to praise. G7, he is Tinsin Erotita, in G70, Tinsin Timiotita. Expected addresses to a distinguished academic churchman, an ex-colleague in Constantinople. Only in G91 is he Timiotita. One might imagine that G90 is to a different academic, a pupil of Theophylact, but all three use the formula, your pupil, my brother, or your pupils, my brothers, not used elsewhere in the correspondence, which suggests that all are to the same scholar. It's not inconceivable that Nikitas was taught by Theophylact, then leapfrogged him on the patriarchal hierarchy, and then while Theophylact was in Bulgaria, taught at least his brother Demetrius, but is far from certain. Gregory Taranites, to whom Theophylact wrote 4 encomiastic letters and is mentioned in a 5th, was a successful soldier in Pondus, where he captured and ransomed Bernard. We see him in G65 before he sets out, most beloved lord to me, preparing himself for warfare. In G78, Prefectio Bellica, wishing him well for the Pontic campaign. In G81, successful after capturing Bernard, and this is where Theophylact claims fatherhood, and in G92 back safely in Constantinople. He's addressed in 2 letters as Megala Pithanestotemienierioye, like Macropolitis and Theophylact Ronios, thus a fender for himself. I've regarded him hitherto as a pupil recycled as a patron, and I think this may well be correct. Gregory Pekorianos, to whom Theophylact wrote 3 letters, is mentioned in 2 more, was Theophylact's favourite local official. In G67, Theophylact thanks Gregory for making a good Gregory Kamateros for making a good appointment. G68 is an Adventus letter, as Gregory Pekorianos arrives in Bulgaria. In G55, he asks help from him with a comparison of Plato's experience with Dionysius in Sicily. And it's in this letter that we find Pansevaste me and Geriolia, the Pansevaste because he's closest to the Comneni, and no other son is addressed in this way. No other son receives a gift of fish. G80 is a reply to an apology. G79, a letter after his departure to Adrian the Grand Domestic praising him. Plato and Dionysius might suggest a teaching relationship, but more likely one of advice. Theophylact perhaps suggests the bright young official took Theophylact's advice seriously. I'm not totally convinced he is an ex-pupil. Among Gautier's suggested candidates, non-sons, there are 2 other officials, Nicholas Animas and John Ophiomachos. We see Nicholas Animas again over his tour of duty. G32, the Adventus letter, request for help. G34, discussion of rusticity and barbarism, with the gift of Christendom. He is Amveronimi Pothinote. G41 is the Propedicon and his departure, describing the tearing apart of friends. It's a charming farewell at the end of his tour of duty. He's Analithinos Philos. The forms of address are not official but emotional, and there doesn't seem to be evidence for him being anything but a welcome official and valued friend. John Ophiomachos we see only on his arrival in G69, where he's urged to combat the Cyclops and Lystragonians. In G71, he's in need of a pep talk. He must carry out his post with courage, as encouraged with the fable of the hares and frogs. Others are more fearful than him. He can be the hero of Salamis, Ajax. He's not addressed formally, but affectionately, or Kala Ioane, or Tharmacia, and again appears to be an official of whom Theophylact was fond. Gautier's final suggestion is Nicholas Mamoutulos, the Grand Drongarius of the Watch, based in Constantinople. We have 5 letters to him, all sparkling with classical learning and friendship. G25 is a request for letters for him to act as Calliope and rescue Theophylact from Amusia through his letters, which are like honey from Hymettus. G29 is about reading, Theophylact's inability to study because the Harpies have overturned his books. Advice to Nicholas on what to read, and a prayer that Theophylact will not forget all his Greek. G33 begs for a letter, as does G57, which also deals with friendship. G76 thanks him for a letter after a long gap of phoenix-like duration, and wishes that he would instead emulate the sun and appear every day. Hypalandra, Anipalandra, Pertera, and their compounds define him as well as Macari. He's clearly a good friend, accustomed to taking Theophylact's advice, but the reading programme suggests a new endeavour rather than lessons in the past, followed with Theophylact. An argument could be made that letters which require a high level of classical learning could be directed to the individuals Theophylact could reasonably expect by experience, his pupils, to be able to understand them. I have looked at this, but I believe that it's not actually, and I'm not going to talk about it now, not a safe indicator of a teacher-pupil relationship. So, assuming that sons are in general pupils, this is my list, what can be said about that teacher-pupil relationship? Unsurprisingly, each relationship appears different. Michael Pantechnes, one of his doctor friends, is the recipient of the most letters in the collection, plus a poem. We see the relationship over time, with Theophylact's concern for him at the time of his father's death, and also concern for his morals after appointment as imperial doctor. With the exception of the Consolatio and 2 very short notes, brief, witty letters discuss visits, advice, medicine, with reference to doctors, mythology, the myth of Alcmaeon, Empedocles' monsters, mostly from familiar school texts, Iliad, Odyssey, Clouds, Phoenicia, and we've seen the appearance of the Antilochus myth. Often there are no forms of address, occasionally Hypalandra, but affect is there in me filter and technon. Michael's a comfort, with the promise of meeting if the emperor's near, and never frequent enough letters. Only in the great crisis when Theophylact is calumny to the emperor is Michael pulled into use to put his teacher's case. The relationship with Gregory Kanteros, the emperor's secretary, appears very different. Letters to him are longer, 1 G1227, very long and gossipy, after his promotion to Protasicretis and Nobilissimos. He's always addressed formally, perhaps in honour of his marriage to a colony. Only in one very short letter, where we're told bearer will give the message, is there no classical allusion. Again, a lot of Homer, Hesiod, Euripides, Pindar, but also Aristotle and Lucian. In G31, Theophylact specifically says he is speaking through the poets, familiar from childhood. We see Cyril and Charybdis, Euryclon, Polyphemus, primed with the reports of Hector, and Theophylact casts himself as Phoenix and Nestor, counsellors to Agamemnon. Gregory is of great use to Theophylact, though not perhaps an Agamemnon. He's thanked for sending a good governor to Ochrid, asked to find a job for a young relative of Michael Psellos, and to override his tax assessment in Theophylact's village of Ecclesia. Theophylact Romaios is the opposite. The 2 letters to him are quite short, packed with jokes and wordplay, but he's never asked for more than a letter. He's addressed as formally as Gregory Kanteros, Labrotita, Megalopiphanestata, even once Ascenda, but also Omakarie, or Kale Gagathe. The letters are about friendship, philosophy, rhetoric, also gentle reproof. Romaios has not written enough. Theophylact is scorned, as Plato was by Aristotle. Though G42 mentions the debt, it's in stark contrast to the letter to John and Teleates. It's packed with playful accusations, though no quotations. Is he a Pythagorean, since he doesn't write? If a peripatetic, should he not emulate Theophrastes and Demetrius of Phaleron? We get the answer in the next letter. He's the right kind of philosopher. A mutual friend, John, has spoken for him, and philosophy transforms beasts to men, unlike Circe and Odysseus, now Homer, Hesiod, Pindar, Plato and Aristotle, combine to praise his head in heaven, his feet on the ground, for that is the mark of a true philosopher. We've seen, on the other hand, But the letter to John Tagliati, where he's addressed as Lamberotete and Cristotete, is boldly transactional. This is what I've given you. This is how you can repay it. If I hear you've done so, I will bless you with the Father's prayers. A single biblical quotation makes the point of reciprocity, whereas the similar letter to the deacon Nikitas or Kapizonos is built on the Antilochus myth of Odyssey 4, buttressed by two four-line references. Both are in the right place at the right time, but not among Theophylact's instruments. Gregory Taraniti, the last of the confirmed pupils, is clearly being groomed as a patron by Theophylact. All four letters are panegyric in tone, and the forms of address are respectful. G65 is a maintenance letter, taking advantage of a letter carrier, and lists the qualities of the young Gregory. What will he become? A new Prometheus? How's he preparing? By military exercise? Will he surpass the hopes of Theophylact, to whom he is most desired? Classical allusions are sparse but regular, teamed with biblical, Pindar, Iliad, for victory and war, but also Sophocles, Lucian, and Lycophron. And when he reaches Pontos, of course, in Medea. If not Prometheus, he seems to resemble the young David. There's much modern debate about the success of that campaign, but Theophylact maintains the panegyric tone to the end, hailing him as a hero on his return to Constantinople, weeping for the situation left behind in Pontus. If he was recycled as a patron, we see only a trace of use in a letter to John Savius, where the recipient is asked to show the letter to Gregory and get a pitacium from him. There is one last pupil that we can see, and now we finally come to the handout. Not correspondence, but with interesting parallels to Gregory, and this time while still a pupil. The Vasilikos Logos, known since seen as the Pedia Vasiliki, is addressed to the young co-emperor Constantine, whom I studied along with his mother in that first Byzantine Slavic article. It's addressed in the lemma to the Porphyrogenitos or Constantine, and he identifies himself as Maestro Convictorum by talking of an annual tax, but identifies also as Othos Didascos. Being called teacher of the emperor gives him wings. He soars 10 cubits high, and he willingly brings a gift of speech today. His words will bring happiness. He addresses him affectionately, as well as formally, and there's been much discussion as to whether Theophylact was Maestro at this point, and also whether he was teacher for the day only. And I suggest he could have been both Maestro and tutor of the young prince, and that the forms of address suggest a personal and affective relationship rather than the simple staging of Rhetor and Laudandus. Can we learn any more from its content? It's a speech to the emperor with included parenthesis, and the relationship between the two forms needs to be teased out. So handout 1. I've elsewhere compared it as a Vasilikos Logos with a speech to Alexius I Komnenos about 3 years later, in terms of the status of the author and recipient, occasion, praise, and blame. I should now like to look at it as an included parenthesis against the background of the advice literature of the period. So that's handout 2. It's clearly not one of Horner's gnomic parentheses, in that it's not a collection of chapters, but the pedia part of the Vasilikos Logos. It has its own inclusion of a didactic section on forms of government and portraits of tyrant, emperor, friend, and flatterer. Before that, it has a series of injunctions. Don't think majesty contributes to power without the virtues that go with it. Don't imagine you're going to hide a bad life like a private citizen. Don't seek to impress warriors with a political border. Set an example in valuing law before pleasure. Wear out pleasure with imperial exercise. And then comes the didactic, introduced by Mantha. The 6 forms are explained, then come the portraits. The tyrant who hides behind fear and terrorizes women, the emperor whose power rests on piety, the friend who is only the good of the emperor at heart and acts like a wise doctor in criticizing the emperor, the flatterer who bites while kissing. We learn how to pick a governor, his ethos, how he runs his household. Then we move to the qualities Constantine needs to cultivate. Assumption of burdens, not pleasure. Constant alertness like a pilot. Omnipresent, but not rashness in war. In peace, you should practice for war, learning from old men and veterans, both old for nous and young for muscle. The emperor should keep this rule: don't eat without sweating. and he should expel actors and clowns from the palace. He should imitate God's Teacher-Pupil by punishing them and dazzle with his good deeds, for a leader of men with superior virtue to those rules. We then move into the conclusion. Theophylact has more to say, but it can wait for another day, and he ends with an injunction to honour Lolly and be honoured by them, to be obedient to his Holy Mother and God his collaborator, and be blessed by them. Compared to the two parentheses closest in date, the Emperor part of Theophylact and the Alexian Communion Musa, the content seems very general. Apart from not eating without sweating, throwing out the actors, and the wonderful intonation that barbarians are not impressed by emperors dressed up as bridegrooms, there's no detail. Theophylact, on the other hand, has loads of detail, together with anecdotal support. Don't pay attention to false accusers, don't promote lower-class foreigners, don't oppress the provinces, don't have taxes daily, store up produce, protect the army and fleet, don't stay in Constantinople, get out into the fields. And the Musa are a mixture of timeless advice and specific autobiographical reminiscence. The First Crusade, the reconquest of the islands, an incident in Korea. The other 12th century included parentheses to emperors, Grotiferata Dionys, and chapter 47 of the life of Theophylact are similarly more detailed, though coming from a borderer and from a holy man are unsurprisingly different. The parametic material in Syndipas and in Stephanites has similarities with Phaedria, but they use their lists and short-form narratives to make specific points. If we widen the corpus to all the advice texts to emperors, the result is not better. Even if we widen it to all advice writing, the result's much the same. Trust in God, honour Lolly, take a lot of physical exercise, pick your friends, and then trust them, is the essence of Theophylact's advice to Constantine. Why is this so? Is it that the speech is directed to a child emperor who doesn't need to know any more, or to a co-emperor who will only be able to do what the emperor lets him? And unfortunately, age and status don't really work. Gautier argues that Constantine was 11 or 12 when the Theophylact was delivered. John Tucker suggests that Leo VI was only 13 when the first parenthesis was written, with all its 66 chapters and richly detailed advice. And the other pair, the parentheses, from imperial father to co-imperial son, are Manuel II to John VIII, the first of which, Foundations, with its 100 chapters, was, according to Florian Leonte, to a miracle at the age of 14, so much of an age. So why is the content of the Theophylact as it is? Might it be that it's to a co-emperor who is politically on the slide? It's notable that there are similarities with G65, the new Prometheus letter to Gregory Terenites. Gregory is at a later stage than Constantine, but the progression from hunting to fighting is clear. I suggest that Theophylact is hedging his bets and writing for a possible future emperor, but also a possible future military aristocrat, maybe a pupil who can be recycled into a patron, like Gregory. He's also writing specifically for a pupil, instilling the same values that inform the letters to his sons, the law of philia and login that he talks about to Romanus. We've seen that the Theophylact starts with the gift of the teacher's eloquence and ends with the exhortation to honour Login and be honoured by them, just as the oration to Alexius starts with the restoration of retors to the palace and ends with the role models of Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, and Commodus in their support for Login. But unlike the oration to Alexius, a whole central section of the Theophylact deals with friendship. He is to protect himself as the rampart of friendship. More significantly, it's the way Constantine will learn his lesson on kingship in the winged chariot of friendship. Other parentheses, of course, deal with friendship, most notably perhaps Stephanites. Theophylact does not, nor do the Musa, nor do they make much of Login. This, philia ke login, is a teacher's gift to an imperial son. So, we see Theophylact interacting with pupils and ex-pupils in ways far from the grumpy accusatory texts with which we began. He's led them through the divine charms of the Muses into a community of learning which has provided them with the skills and the astiotes which are the entree to brilliant careers, but he's placed them in influential positions and turns to them from time to time to get him a document or deliver a letter or help a bishop or make the right appointment. But he continues to often enjoy from them emotional support, so that this is an emotional community as well. He rejoices in their successes, though he worries about the dangers of being at court. He enjoys the chance to offer counsel and reinforce their shared values in sparkling confections, which wrap up the reciprocity of the debt of teaching in riddles and myths and wordplay. He also draws into the circle the young officials like Nicholas Animas, John Ophiomachos, and Gregory Pakurianos on their tour of duty in Bulgaria, and rejoices when one of his children can help another, thus mitigating crime against Philia and Loyi, which was the failure to communicate. They are most dear to me, of all most yearned for, Teknon, yours. Sadly, we have no reply from the pupil, so we don't know whether each one hailed him as a benefactor, carving his name on the stele of his eternal soul, as he had hoped in G2. But as Constantine Acropolitis was to put it 200 years later, the teacher is also a father, since, as we have learned, he is the cause of well-being. Thank you.